Go ahead and get started. I'm Paige Tollison, and I am the Program and Communications Manager at the Institute on Ecosystems. I want to welcome everyone to our Rough Cut seminar series. Today's seminar is a part of an ongoing series focused on sharing and distributing up-and-coming research. And as a part of that seminar series, next week we will hear from Catherine Dunlop and Gretchen Mitten talking about the importance of the environmental humanities in a changing world. So I hope you all can join us for that. As a reminder, please be sure to turn your cameras and microphones off during the presentation and save your questions for the end of the talk. We are recording today's seminar and it will be posted by the end of today onto the IOE's website. With all that being said, I will hand it over to Kelly Romer, who will be introducing our speaker, Dr. Debra Davidson.
Thank you, Paige. Hi, my name is Kelly Romer. I'm a PhD candidate at MSU in the Resources and Communities Research Group. It is my pleasure to get to introduce our IOE Rough Cut speaker today. Dr. Debra Davidson is a professor of environmental sociology at the University of Alberta. Her research and teaching are focused on social responses to environmental and climate change, particularly in our energy and agri-food systems. She was a recipient of the Killam Annual Professorship Award and was a lead author on the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. She is the co-author of 2 recent books, including the Oxford Handbook of Energy and Society and Environment and Society Concepts and Challenges. Dr. Davidson received her PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison in 1998. Without further ado, I will pass it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. I'm just sitting with this new label of being a rough cut speaker. I'm gonna maybe use that. So first of all, I just want to start with a full disclosure and an extra thank you, because you are allowing me to share basically what is the outcome of just a deep dive down a rabbit hole that started about 5 years ago. And it's I won't say that it was entirely by accident, but it definitely wasn't where I thought I was going. And basically, long story short, I was involved in some research on the social impacts of hydraulic fracturing here in Alberta. And I was really interested in kind of putting a social movement lens on those impacts and community responses. But after 10 minutes into my first interview, I was just so struck by the narratives that I was hearing from my interview respondents and how their experiences have affected them, deeply emotionally, and the consequences of that. And so that just took me in an entirely new direction, and I started reading about emotions and reading, and I'm still reading and trying to put it all together, because as you can imagine, it's a deeply interdisciplinary subject matter, and every new discipline, at least new to me discipline, has something new to offer on this enormous subject. But what I have been focused on in particular for the last couple of years is the role that emotions play in our social responses to climate change in particular. So I'm going to start with a little bit of just kind of basic background on emotions. What are emotions, before I delve into trying to articulate how emotions play a role in our social responses to climate change, looking at both pathways that favor action and pathways that favor inaction. I'm going to just try to work my way through this content while leaving plenty of time for discussion, because I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So just straightforward, there's a lot of terms that are used very colloquially, but have very specific meanings. So just by way of clarification, I think it's important to just give a little bit of sort of definitional understanding. So there are sensations that we're aware of, but that are purely biophysical in cause and expression, like pain and hunger and pleasure. Those are not necessarily emotions. Emotions are basically feelings that we are conscious of. Okay. And that's an important difference in the literature in particular, and when you hear or you see different usages of terms like emotions and affect, and sometimes they're used, I think, in confusing ways. So we as a species have the broadest emotional palette of any species out there, and the way that our emotions have how we have evolved to encompass such a broad emotional palette, I think, is a fascinating story in and of itself. Don't have a lot of time for that here today, but just to start off our conversation on that note, if we can move to the next slide here. Now, I am very much a sociologist, and for a lot of sociologists, we're not supposed to talk about biology, but I'm a rule breaker in many ways, and I have found it particularly valuable to me and my understanding as a sociologist of emotions to delve into what the biological sciences have to say about emotions. And so very big historical and rich literature, but there are just a handful of key points that I think are particularly important for us. First of all, there's no single part of the brain that controls emotions. There are multiple parts of our brain that control different types of emotions. So basic emotions like fear, for example, are governed by the oldest parts of our brain, but some of our sort of what we would consider uniquely human emotions evolved later and are basically associated with the newest parts of our brain as well. So things like morality, things like empathy, shame, which I'm going to talk about here in a little bit. But how it works, I think, is even more important. And the main take-home point here is that emotions play a role in every action, every decision that we make. The way it works is our brain rapidly detects stimuli in our environment constantly. This is playing, we are taking in far more information in that manner than we're capable of actively processing, much less doing so consciously. But there are certain things that happen in our environment that trigger us. And that's what initially draws our attention to some things and not to others. And then we integrate this entirely sensory information with memories, with personal preferences, social norms. And then we do what Antonio Damaso calls we go through a marking process. We mark certain things that are going on in our environment for appraisal. And this is when cognition sets in. This is when deliberation kicks in. So this whole emotion cognition process has evolved in ways that support, our survival as a species to trigger adaptive behaviors. But it has also become, an integral part of living in groups, cooperation, learning through knowledge sharing as well. And there's just one more, I think, important lesson from the natural sciences that I want to share with you. If we can move on to the next slide here, please. Some of you may already be familiar with the work that is that basically speaks to the differences between fast thinking and slow thinking. Daniel Kahneman writes about this a lot. He was prefaced by a number of other scientists. However, in particular, Joseph Ledoux who wrote a book called The Emotional Brain. And Ledoux actually, you know, has been able to show the very different actual sort of neural pathways that represent these two forms of thinking, fast thinking and slow thinking. So fortunately, we are fast thinkers, as are, you know, most other species on the planet. Fast thinking is, you know, absolutely critical to responding quickly to dangers and opportunities and so forth. And it's also an enormously, I guess, useful means of, again, processing just a ton of information. And it allows us to make, you know, quick and dirty decisions. However, if we're sort of approaching an issue that involves a high level of uncertainty, perhaps has enormous consequences for us, or in other ways quite meaningful, then what we would really need to do is engage in slow thinking. So to basically engage our sensory cortex, as Ledoux would talk about. But of course, the problem is that this takes more effort. There's a researcher who basically refers to the degree to which our brain is the biggest calorie consumer in our body. In fact, Yuval Harari, some of you might be familiar with Harari's work. He says, and I quote, "A jumbo brain is a jumbo drain on the body." And so this in part explains why often we don't end up using our, you know, our slow thinking capacities at times when we actually should be, particularly when we're busy, when we're distressed, and taking that low road and engaging in fast thinking is just easier for us. So that's kind of some of the main pieces of that biological layer that I think are important to a broader discussion of emotions and climate change. So next slide, please. There's also an essential social layer to our emotions and our emotionality. And, you know, this is also part of the reason why I think it's just so fundamentally important to engage in these topics from an interdisciplinary perspective, because there are so many sort of additional elements and nuances that social scientists bring to our understanding of emotions that are important here. First, and importantly, is simply the fact that we have the capacity to override what might be considered sort of inherited or evolutionarily derived behavior triggers. So you might, you know, feel like punching somebody in the face, but the fact that you don't, you know, is a pretty valuable trait. Many of our emotional deliberations are, in fact, not just reactions to our environment in the same way, say that you know, a prey species might be reacting to their environment. We're also reacting to you know, those essential components of our environment that consist of socio-cultural phenomena. And this includes expectations, and it also includes kind of our starting point, what our social position is. And they're also just deeply relational phenomena. So we engage, these are just two examples of kind of the relational component of our emotions, but we all tend to engage in emotion management. We align our emotions with those that we perceive to be acceptable in a given situation. And sometimes that actually, you know, lends itself towards shifting, you know, where we're at that particular moment as well. And other times it just means you're gonna, you know, do a lot of work to try to, you know, present yourself in a way that you know, is kind of discrepant from how you're really feeling. But we can also have our emotional state shift on the basis of what's going on around us with others as well. Some folks call this emotional contagion. There's some interesting research that has started to observe the degree to which we can experience emotional contagion even online in social media. So just really interesting research here about all of the different factors that influence our emotions at any given point in time. And then there's one more point, I think, here again that is particularly important to bear in mind with respect to the social layer. If we can move on to the next slide here. And that is just the tremendous role that emotions play and how they have evolved kind of in conjunction with our group-oriented behavior. So group belonging has been key to our survival as a species, our ability to cooperate again and share knowledge. And it has been a particularly strong driver of human emotions as well. So our sense of self, for example, our identity is formed through association with groups. And when our sense of self and our identity are gratified through group belonging, that's a great feeling. And we tend to basically, behave in ways in which we can enjoy those positive feelings of group belonging. That also translates into a tendency to treat others and the information, importantly for us, that others provide that are outside of our group. So we end up, along with group belonging, also becomes basically the shunning of out groups. So the reason that we tend to follow cultural rules that are prescribed within certain social groups is because belonging feels good and being ostracized doesn't. And so this has just a whole host of implications, one of which is that for a lot of us, we're inclined to go with the flow, to not open up our mouth when perhaps we disagree with others around us. And it supports things like, imitating our leaders and basically being, deferential to those opinion leaders or those reputational leaders in our groups. So group factor is, just a really important element of our emotionality that sociologists in particular have brought to the fore here. So next slide here. Okay, so I think, given the enormity of the literature on emotions and, and its interdisciplinary character, for those of us who don't have, the time and the resources to actually go pursue another degree in a different discipline, I think there are just a handful of really valuable, I hate to use the term rules of thumb, but just simple rules, we'll say, that are really helpful in helping us to understand how emotions come into play in social contexts. And this is a really good one for me, and is basically, we all as individuals are attracted to positive emotions, and we seek to avoid negative emotions. And a lot of our behavior is governed by this simple rule. So what makes us feel good? What makes us feel bad? Well, let's take a look at that. We'll go to, if we can go to the next slide here. So you can just go ahead and I animated this slide, so you can just go ahead and keep pulling them all up here. The last one will be efficacy, so let's stop there. Okay, wasn't intending to have somebody else share my slides for me today, so apologize if this is a little bit clunky. But so let's talk about what makes us feel good. Well, relationships, finding mutual care, love in relationships obviously feels awesome. Group belonging, which I've already mentioned, is also, comes with a number of positive emotions. Having our identity validated, rather than perhaps being approached by others in a way that invalidates our identities. That feels good. Having an opportunity to share emotions, even in just a context like going to sporting events and sharing that emotions of enthusiasm for your team. Pride feels good. So we don't need to go through all of these in detail, but each of these has basically been subject to a lot of research. The kinds of things that generate positive emotions for people, and the means by which we tend to gravitate towards situations that reinforce positive feelings. So if we can move to the next slide, and you can go ahead and pull them all up, and the last one is powerlessness. Oh, too far. So on the other hand, what makes us feel bad? None of this should be, a surprise to any of you here either. So loneliness, in many ways, loneliness is, a pretty good survival mechanism. If it's the case that group belonging is beneficial to survival, feeling lonely is kind of like feeling hungry. It's a trigger that something's wrong and you need to go out and seek social support. Having your identity challenged, feeling shame, guilt, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a minute here. So these are all the different the kinds of conditions or situations that make us feel bad and that we tend to avoid. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So let's take a look at, again, there's a whole host of emotions, I think, that are important, but I think there's a handful of them that are particularly important when we're talking about climate change and our emotional responses to climate change. So I want to just unpack these a little bit further. So shame and guilt are actually two different emotions, but I'm gonna treat them the same here. So they play a role in society in that they sanction behavior. So to the extent to which you avoid engaging in activities that aren't considered socially acceptable in your community, simply because you don't want to feel shame about that, then that's a pretty effective way of sanctioning behaviors. When we violate moral norms, we tend to to feel guilt about that, and generally any way that we behave in ways that are perceived to be culturally incompetent, we tend to feel more shame in those situations. Now, bear in mind these. I've been discussing these emotions as somewhat having social utility, I guess you can say, and they maintain conformity and group cohesion and so on. But they clearly cut both ways too, and I'm sure that you all can come up with plenty of examples. The whole idea of the fact that those moral norms, the expected behaviors, can be closely linked to things like class and ethnicity and gender, and other ways in which power differentials can be maintained are really important to bear in mind. So let's move on to kind of the other side of that coin, and that's pride. We all, of course, love to feel pride. And this also supports group belonging and cooperation, because we often feel proud when the feeling of pride is received by other members of our community. So they're showing appreciation for what we did, and sometimes that's in the context of our community as well. So in a social system in which norms support cooperation, oftentimes this includes things like giving, personal sacrifice in service to the community. So all of these, again, are, very adaptable, very, constructive emotions that support things like group belonging. But here too, of course, there's, there's two sides to pride as well. So let's move on to the next one that I think is really important, and I've just been reading a lot about empathy lately. Empathy is a little bit more complicated than either shame, guilt, or pride in that it encompasses both an emotional and a cognitive component. So basically, the capacity to put yourself in another's shoes is not strictly an emotional reaction, right? That's a cognitive capacity, and it takes work. Some really interesting research here, which kind of differentiates situations that evoke empathy, and then also just like the inherent differences in the predispositions towards trait empathy. So women, for example, have a tendency to express higher levels of empathy. Interestingly, here too, there's some research that shows that people on the more liberal end of the spectrum are inclined to express higher levels of empathy than people on the conservative end of the spectrum. So a lot of recent research that is trying to unpack empathy. But importantly, I think even though, there's a lot of work that kind of shows that there's, differences in kind of an inherited predispositions for empathy, we all have the capacity to, as Arlie Hochschild says, expand our empathy map. So none of this is, predetermined or given. And also, this is one of those, I guess, traits or practices that generates positive emotions. Again, a lot of empirical research that has been focused on the degree to which undertaking actions on the basis of empathy can generate positive emotions. So it feels good. Feels good to care. Okay, moving more into the realm of climate change here. Just one kind of final caveat with this really brief overview of research on emotions. This is not a linear system at all, and I know I've been kind of alluding, talking about it in some ways the way it is. But our neural systems are, to use Charles Perrow's terms, extremely interactively complex. Just kind of as one case in point that will become, a little bit more relevant, as social practice theorists have made clear, but also some interesting neuroscience and psychology research, sometimes doing things happens before the feeling and thinking. So engaging in a particular practice or having an opportunity to shift practices can basically generate changes in sort of emotional responses. So it's not necessarily always a one-way street from emotion to cognition to action. So I think that's just something really important to think about, particularly as we begin to start to conceive of ways to enhance pro-climate action. Maybe starting with the action in some cases can work. Okay, next slide, please. So just very briefly to try to sort of conceive of how emotions enter into the fray, as it were, in responses to climate change. I like to think of it in this manner, and again, with the big caveat that it's nothing is nearly as linear as this graphic would suggest. But once we're, we are continuously exposed to just a universe of stimuli, far too much for us to actually, take up and process in any way. but we select certain stimuli for appraisal. And that appraisal process is inevitably shaped by our social relations, interactions with others, the community we live in, and so forth. And then at the end of that process of appraisal, we tend to choose actions. And the actions that we choose, of course, are going to have outcomes that are either going to support sort of institutional stability or institutional change. And all of that happens and is continually interacting with our socio-structural and economic and ecological contexts. So given that, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so let's start talking about climate change and how our emotions come into play here. Well, the first set of relevant emotions are in that trigger process. They're involved in, signaling threat. And then it's the second set of emotions that are those involved in, or those that allow for collective action and problem solving. So next slide, please. So the first thing that we have to consider is what is the trigger? So, we are hardwired to respond to clear and present danger, like a bear on the trail, for example. All of our attention immediately becomes laser focused on that potential threat. Survival instinct kicks in. But for the vast majority of us, climate change does not enter into our reality in the form of a bear on the trail. We end up getting, a variety of different kinds of information that serve as the potential trigger. Sometimes we're directly, perhaps, involved in an extreme event like a fire. Although even in those cases, we would basically need to draw connections between that extreme event and the degree to which climate change played a role in that event. For the vast majority of us, it comes in the form of media. That is the means by which we are introduced to the topic of climate change. And then for a very small handful of us, it directly comes from in the form of scientific information. And each of these has more or less, likelihood to actually trigger, attention and response by individuals, and that is going to be different for every individual too. So am I receiving consistent messages? Can I draw causal links to the threat and the things that are important to me? And do I understand the language of the message? So there are a lot of things about the trigger that is climate change that are messy, ambiguous, and may not generate a cognitive response to the extent that we might like. So next slide, please. Once that that triggering process, or at least the opportunity for that trigger, presents itself, then we basically are start the process of appraisal and response. And there are a number of different buckets that we could put our social responses to climate change in. But I think if we're using an emotion lens, I think these are the most important ones for me. And they include three pathways that are basically lend themselves towards inaction. One is apathy, then denial and withdrawal. And then the fourth one, the only one that represents an action response. So let's take a look at each of those in turn briefly. So next slide, please. This is my daughter's artwork, by the way. She, I had her help me a couple of, a little while ago, because I always struggle with trying to come up with my own graphics. And so she said she can help. And so I've been using them ever since. So what does apathy really represent then? It basically means that the trigger didn't happen at all. So there's no emotion trigger here. So climate information is not marked for deliberation. And this is true for a lot of people. Climate change is an abstract concept. There's a lot of ambiguities associated with it. And many of us are just so busy, preoccupied, stressed out about other stuff that we can miss the trigger. And of course, research suggests that concern for climate change is on the rise, particularly over the last couple of years, thankfully. But nonetheless, I think we should not, disregard the degree to which apathy is, can continue to be a prevalent response to climate change. So the next one we can take a look at, if we can move on to the next slide, is denial. Tons of really important research across the social sciences looking at processes of, or looking at climate denial, why it's so prevalent and where, and sources of political influence that generate denial. But the degree to which an individual is receptive to those denial discourses, I think, is really where we get to the heart of the role of emotions here. So for a lot of people, perhaps for all of us, the knowledge that the knowledge that humans cause global warming and that it is detrimental, that's a tough pill to swallow. And so for a lot of people, they would rather reject that pill than take it. And so in this case, this is fundamentally different than apathy, even though it might look the same. But for people who at least conceptually are engaged in denial, they are having a very strong emotional reaction because they have been triggered. They have information about climate change has definitely caught their attention. So denial is a valuable coping mechanism. There's no doubt about that. And I think it's also important to note, and plenty of research to back this up as well, is we can celebrate the fact that the proportion of people in survey research that explicitly rejects the assertion that humans cause global warming is small and shrinking. But nonetheless, I still think we can discuss the degree to which, many of us nonetheless exhibit some degree of denial, at least some of the time. And also, and this I think is an important differentiation from those people who experience withdrawal. And that is what may be overwhelming here is not necessarily the prospects of climate change, of our climate emergency, but rather climate change knowledge, the very idea, that the paradigm, I guess, of climate change and the degree to which it threatens, interests, identities, cultures, cultural values, and so forth. So let's take a look at withdrawal then. Next slide, please. So there's growing attention lately about climate change anxiety, and it it is increasingly being recognized as a problem. Shouldn't say a problem, a phenomenon. Climate change anxiety, or just feeling anxiety about anything, could be a trigger to actually taking action. There are a lot of people who feel anxious about climate change who end up becoming climate activists. But for a number of individuals, anxiety can lead to withdrawal when they don't have either the social support or the mental capacity to respond. And so they're more likely to basically resort to withdrawal as their emotion coping mechanism. And both the tendency to feel deeply anxious about climate change, and perhaps also the possibility of that anxiety leading towards withdrawal is particularly acute amongst certain groups, particularly those groups who are have a higher attachment to place. Think indigenous peoples here, very, very much so. Their sense of belonging and their relationship, with the land and their place is, the prospect of climate change and the inevitable changes to those places can be deeply anxiety inducing. And a lot of individuals in those situations may also be in positions in which they are less likely to have the emotion coping resources that can allow them to work through that anxiety and not end up in a state of withdrawal. Okay, fourth one, let's talk about action. So this is, as sort of depicted in that framework, this is when climate change information is marked, deliberation kicks in, and that process leads towards pro-climate action. So conceptually, as using this emotion lens, action is most likely to result when an appropriate threat response is triggered. So basically depicting climate change as the very serious threat that it is. And also when that also triggers care, not just for oneself, but for others. So empathy for others. And it is also most likely to happen when engaging in pro-climate behaviors are rewarded, even in the form of those positive emotions that we talked about before. And then finally, and this is absolutely critical, it's most likely to result when those triggered individuals feel a sense of efficacy, feel as if they can actually, take those emotions and translate them into meaningful action. So there's again here a lot of research on climate action. What are the triggers to climate action? What are the barriers to it? If we can move to the next slide, I just want to share a handful of findings from empirical research that focus specifically on kind of the intersections between emotions and pro-climate action. So the first one is, in fact, most of the research that focuses on emotions and climate change comes from communication studies, and there's been some really interesting work done here. Basically, I think one of the more important findings from this work is that information that evokes emotional reactions to climate change are more likely to motivate action. Now think about how that kind of flies in the face of the tendency to want to educate publics with science, with the facts, and the presumption that that factual information is going to generate a response. It might generate a response when you're talking to other scientists and they speak the language of data, but not necessarily the case for the vast majority of us who don't fall in that category. Again, action is very strongly associated with both efficacy and empathy. It's kind of alluding back to my point that sometimes the process is not necessarily emotion, cognition, action, but sometimes you can, you could start with action. There's been some research that has focused on those individuals who are engaging in some form of practice, whether it's activism or personal behavior change, and showing that maybe they became engaged in those activities for other reasons, but in the process of doing so, they experienced positive emotions that basically led to their sort of further instilling their participation in those things. Finally, pro-climate action is definitely more likely to be sustained when the individuals engaging in them, in those collective engagements, can be sustained with group belonging. And I think this is even true for personal behaviors. When you think about people who choose, let's say, to sell their car or to change their eating habits, to have a support group, as it were, who are also engaging in those activities, is going to be far more likely to lend itself towards the longevity of those behavior changes. And then lastly, a lot of interesting work on the role of hope here too, and the difference between hope and optimism, I think, is really important here. Optimism can sometimes lend itself towards complacency, because optimism means that you're confident that things are going to get better, whereas we can have hope even in situations in which expectations of positive outcomes are low. And amongst a lot of empirical research that has focused on people who are engaged particularly in collective action towards climate change, hope seems to be that sort of emotional experience that just transcends demographic group, geographic location, and so forth. So just some closing thoughts here. What is most unique about us as a species is our self-awareness and our awareness of our self-awareness. And this is basically what I call reflexivity. And that reflexivity gives us the capacity to change. So regardless of what our predispositions are, regardless of what our hard wiring that might lend itself towards inaction or withdrawal might suggest, we have the capacity to change, and we have the capacity to increase our sort of expand our empathy maps. We have the capacity to change our behaviors. And emotions play a fundamental role in these processes, particularly in basically shifting gears and shifting our map. Denial and withdrawal, this is just kind of I would love to see more research that maybe explores this a little bit further. Denial and withdrawal are both emotion management tactics. And so if we conceive of them as this, then that opens up a whole host of possibilities for how we can perhaps try to dissuade those pathways and try to bring people towards a more pro-climate or action-oriented pathway. Through perhaps even just building emotional support and coping skills among those groups. Okay, I have one last slide just in closing. Have to end with Charles Darwin. Those species which do not change go extinct. So thank you very much for hearing me out. I would love to hear your thoughts. I know we've got a few minutes here, but if we don't get to any of your questions or ideas, I really would love to have you pop me an email so we can continue the conversation. This is a collective effort here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Davidson. I'd love to open it up for the last 12 minutes for some discussion. Perhaps folks can turn on their screens. We can be a little bit more personal here. Andrea, you started us off with a question in the chat. Would you like to ask it?
Sure. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. You know, I was thinking about some of the youth climate leaders, Greta Thunberg, and then I've been reading about Ada Crandall in Portland. She's working to fight freeway expansion in that area recently. And you know, I was thinking about how do we help the youth feel empowered and, you know, take action for what they're learning about in school, but also not expose them to, I mean, sometimes really vicious public attacks of them, and also just sort of real existential stress. How do we support our young people kind of grappling with this and trying to be public and take action, but also kind of try and protect them. I don't know if that's the right word. Any thoughts? Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for the question, and I do appreciate it. There's just so much that could be said here. I'll just share really briefly that I was involved in a youth project a few years ago, in which I got to basically observe and participate in an initiative that brought high school age youth who were concerned about climate change together into an international learning experience. And what I heard time and time again amongst so many of those individuals is that they felt so isolated, and that was just so hard for them. It just sort of it compounded the concerns that they had for climate change to begin with, to have to and endure those concerns in isolation. And so one of the easiest things that we can do is just connect those students, connect those youth that we have in our midst, so that they can support each other. I mean, so many of those same youth that I worked with were just so gratified, felt so empowered, simply by virtue of having an opportunity to recognize that they weren't alone, that there were so many other people out there in the world who shared their concerns, and just to have that space to do that with their peers, not with their moms and their teachers. So I think that's number one.
Wonderful. And then in the chat, Scott had a response to Andrea. I wonder if you wanted to share, or we can move to Jamie too.
Can you hear me okay? This is Scott. I guess I had thought that, I think that was a quote now that I see that Andrea was putting forth from a paper, but regardless, there are things going on in our state that are associated with kids, and one of them is the Our Children's Trust lawsuit that just got a court date set for February of next year, where kids are suing using the public trust doctrine, and that might be something that a person struggling as a younger person in our state might want to get a hold of, follow up on. As long as I'm on, can I ask a question? My question is, Debra, you mentioned shame, guilt, and empathy as motivators to move people from climate apathy, denial to action. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we motivate people who apparently feel no shame, guilt, or empathy. And I say that kind of facetiously, but also it's real. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, Scott, I struggle with this too, and I struggle to remain empathic towards certain groups of people, but I think what I remind myself of is that there are unless you have seriously had your brain compromised in some way, everyone has the capacity for empathy. Everyone is needs to feel a sense of belonging. Everyone is basically capable of feeling shame and guilt and pride. It's just that the context in which those feelings emerge for them are not what we would think. It's not about, well, you're driving a big big Ford F-150, aren't you ashamed? Well, no, that's the sense of pride for me, because that's my people. So just taking heart in the fact that we we all do have all of these same attributes, and it's just trying to figure out how to navigate given that rather than fighting against it. So it's not that people have no shame, it's just that they're not feeling shame for the things that we think they should be feeling shame about.
Got it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Jamie, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I am Jamie Kirby. I work with urban and community forestry, and so I see a lot of the social aspects here applying. I am curious, and maybe this is probably related to the political influence more is, I asked in the chat, is like, has there been much work in understanding the corporate sector and their perceptions? For instance, has there been any work with the leadership within to do some of this kind of shift in how they see what they're doing affects the overall climate, if that makes sense?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jamie. And to my knowledge, or at least not that I've been exposed to, I think that would be an enormously interesting line for research to take. But I also I think it's also important to consider the context of a corporation. Both as, embodying, institutional norms and cultures as well, but also, the means by which each of those individuals, they might have a, very personal, emotional response, and yet, there's, a counter set, I suppose, of social pressures that will basically I guess stifle that tendency. I don't know if I'm articulating that very well, but yeah, individuals, on the one sense, we are all individuals and we all, have these same capacities. On the other hand, we're also sitting, in very different intersectional and institutional positions, which also define our behavior as well.
Very much. That makes sense. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? I don't see any hands raised, but feel free to turn on your screen and ask a question. Well, I have a question. I am wondering, this sort of approach, a way of connecting emotions and action feels really relevant to a lot of the work that I'm doing, studying the coal transition and people's reluctance to plan for, prepare until closure has already happened. And I wonder if you see that too with some of the wildfire, the folks who are motivated when they're impacted immediately, or what is that a big thing? Like they need to be personally impacted before they are motivated to act collectively? Yeah, how does that play in your work, and how are you applying it in your work?
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. I'm interested in following up with you guys in your work on coal transition, because we're working on some similar work here with oil workers who aren't necessarily transitioning, but sort of exploring some of those identity based issues. To your question though, of the role of having like a really emotionally acute event, like experiencing a wildfire, and the degree to which that might serve as a trigger that can shift somebody into a position of high climate concern. There hasn't been nearly enough empirical research on that yet, but there has been some, and it's been, I think, really interesting. And one of the most interesting things that I think that research reveals is the degree to which that extreme event experience is only likely to lead to elevated concern amongst those individuals who are already, at the very least, agree that climate change is occurring. And so, for those people who are climate deniers, they will be a climate denier after the event, just to the same degree as they were before the event. So what, what degree of intensity of extreme event or frequency of extreme events it will take to cause a wider shift is really unclear. But that's just a brand new area of research, and I've only come across maybe a half a dozen empirical studies, which, you know, looks at that phenomenon. So it's still wide open, and let's follow up later on transitions, because I think that's important too.